Okay, as people are starting to filter in, I'm going to begin our live stream panel. I'm delighted to welcome you to Read for Action, Climate, Conflict, and Humanitarian Crisis. Read for Action is a project at the intersection of public humanities, environmental humanities, and public advocacy and policy change, based at the University of Virginia's Humanitarian Collaborative and in partnership with the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. It launched last year at the Global Climate Conference, COP27 in Egypt. My name is Adrienne Ghaly, and I'm an assistant professor of English at the University of Virginia and a primary architect of Read for Action, along with Professor Kirsten Gelsdorf, director of the Humanitarian Collaborative at UVA's Batten School for Public Policy. I want to thank our research assistants, Kaylee Mullins and Lacey Wurtzel, for their work on today's event. Before I introduce our panelists today, I want to speak briefly about why we created Read for Action, and for those just joining us, how it works. Our project attempts to respond to an urgent challenge of humanitarian public advocacy now: how to build more durable engagement on humanitarian crises, especially with Generation Z, in ways that don't utilize the photography of despair or the short-termism of engaging with complex humanitarian issues solely through social media. Kirsten and I were both interested in these questions. I, as a professor of modern and contemporary literature, and Kirsten is someone who not only teaches global humanitarian response, but who worked for years for UN OCHA in public advocacy and policy. We thought that fiction might be a better way in to longer engagement on public policy challenges. And so we spoke with the public advocacy team at OCHA, including Ruth Makwana, a humanitarian and fiction writer, and Kirsten Mildren, who leads public advocacy at OCHA. And we piloted the idea of a humanitarian book club. The concept is read, connect, act, and research. So it's not just a regular book club. Read for Action brings together incredible contemporary fiction writers with the reality of the global humanitarian response. It's a global community reading and discussing together contemporary stories of people caught in crisis and connecting the novels to real-time policy issues through events and conversations in person and on our digital platform. We bring readers together with policy professionals supporting the needs of affected communities from organizations such as the UN, UNICEF, and Sesame Workshop, authors and academics who discuss the books in real-world contexts. And we research the idea of using fiction for social good with an interdisciplinary team that includes a social psychologist, Sophie Trewalter, a literary scholar, Gloria Fisk at Queens College CUNY, and other researchers working at the intersection of literature and social change. You can find out more at readforaction.org. And I'll put that in the chat for everyone. So I'm delighted to introduce our three panelists today, and I'll introduce them in the order in which they speak. Anuk Arudpragasam is a novelist and translator from Colombo, Sri Lanka, and he currently lives in Berlin. He's the author of A Passage North, about the long aftermath of the Sri Lankan War, published by Granta in 2021, which was shortlisted for the 2021 Booker Prize. He received his doctorate in philosophy from Columbia University in 2019, and his earlier novel, The Story of a Brief Marriage, published by Flatiron and Granta in 2016, is a meditation on violence, trauma, and marginality set during the last weeks of the Sri Lankan Civil War. It was winner of the 2017 DSC Prize for South Asian Literature, shortlisted for the 2017 Dylan Thomas Prize, and named a top 10 novel of 2016 by the Wall Street Journal, as well as a best book of the year by NPR, The Guardian, The Boston Globe, The Financial Times, and many others. Anuk is currently working on a third novel about mothers and daughters in the Tamil diaspora, set partly in New York and Toronto. Rebecca Vetharaniam Richards has 24 years of experience working in the United Nations system in political affairs, peacekeeping, humanitarian, and transition planning and response. She specializes in strategic planning, emergency coordination, and policy development, and her experience includes the 2000 Afghanistan crisis, the Pakistan earthquake and floods, the cyclone response in Myanmar, and the Somalia crisis. She's worked in conflict resolution and peace negotiations at the Afghanistan-Bonn peace talks and served as political affairs officer in the United Nations Special Mission to Afghanistan before moving to the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Rebecca also served as Chief of Emergencies and Transitions, where she led the policy and program work on peace and conflict, which followed 5 years heading the regional office of the Middle East and North Africa Bureau during the World Food Programme's rapid scale up in its response to the Syrian crisis. She currently works alongside the Food and Agricultural Organization to lead the World Food Programme's global network against food crises. Patrick Deere is Associate Professor in the English Department at NYU, where he teaches modern and contemporary British, American, and Anglophone literature and the medical humanities, and is a faculty fellow in residence. In addition to his book on World War II writing, Culture and Camouflage, War, Empire, and Modern British Literature, published by Oxford University Press, he's published widely on transatlantic modernism and contemporary literature, war literature and war culture, music, and film. He guest edited a special issue of Social Text on the ends of war and co-edited the special issues Reflections on the Work of Edward Said and Punk and Its Afterlives. His recent essays include Despicable Beauty, The Embedded Sublime and the Poetics of Violence in Iraq War Reportage in Social Text 2023, Beyond Recovery, Representing History and Memory in Iraq War Writing in Modern Fiction Studies in 2017, and Mapping Contemporary American War Culture in College Literature in 2016. He's the faculty coordinator of the NYU Cultures of War and the Post-War Research Group, which offers public programming with scholars, veterans, organizers, writers, and artists. And he co-hosts the Words After War Civilian Veteran Writers Workshop. Patrick's current book project is We Are All Embedded, Understanding American War Culture Since 9/11. So we'll start with an overarching question, the one that we begin every panel. And as our panelists speak, I invite our audience to please put any questions you have in the Q&A box at any time. And I invite you to sort of answer in the order in which I've introduced you. So starting with Anuk, then Rebecca, and then Patrick. But what do you think fiction can offer for understanding and engaging with specific issues around humanitarian crisis that other forms cannot or not as well?
Thanks, Adrienne, for the lovely introduction and for organizing this conversation. It's a difficult question for me because I don't know if the particular things that draw me to fiction drew me to it in virtue of the fact that I was writing a lot about war and about kind of large-scale violence. But I suppose for me, what fiction does, or often does, I mean, there's a kind of writing that refuses to enter the minds of characters, the interior life of characters. But the kind of fiction I'm in is very much immersed in the inner lives of its characters, is continually attributing thoughts, conjectures, feelings, making interpretations, basically, doubting those interpretations, revising them, coming up with alternatives. For me, in fiction, there's this constant project of trying to see a coherent and sympathetic inner life behind the facade of a voice and a gaze and a body. And when I can't speak for all humanitarian crises, but when it comes to, for example, the civil war in Sri Lanka and the genocide with which it entered, what one is presented with as somebody, as myself, who was not present in this time, was a series of images, often very horrific images, images depicting hundreds and thousands of people, images that one glances and moves on from, images in which it's very hard, images in which I guess the human is reduced to the body by violence, in which there is, it's very difficult when you see pictures of people in such situations to see anything but a body. And for me, fiction and its project of, at least in the tradition of fiction that I am involved with, its project of constantly interpreting, of constantly trying to find something behind the surface of a human being, is something that allows you to come closer to the subjects that you are writing about. For me, I was presented with my own community, people who speak my language and share a culture and share a history. And I was presented with the very horrifying, with this very difficult situation in which I was not able to see them as full people, because of what this situation had reduced them to. And so for me, fiction was a way of making these images three-dimensional in some way, by giving inner life to these people.
Thank you. What an incredible response to that question. And I don't want to sort of speak anymore. I just want to hand it over to Rebecca and have her respond.
Thanks, Adrienne. It's hard to follow Anuk after that one. But for me, fiction, in terms of my work and our response also in humanitarian crisis, in truth, I hadn't thought deeply about it. In the way that we had been working, there's so little time for anything beyond reports. So to have the time to read a book or a novel, I hadn't in truth dedicated the time that I would have liked. And actually reading a passage north over the last few weeks has been hugely insightful. And I found myself questioning a lot of my own sort of thoughts and the way that we work in the industry because of the book and because of the way that it's written. And what I do realize is that, not to be oversimplistic, but in the industry of humanitarian response, and there's a huge amount of coordination of different actors, policy work, the day-to-day that absolutely removes you so far away from the people that you're trying to serve and from the people who are actually impacted by conflict. And the book and the thought of actually the role of fiction and reading when it comes to humanitarian action is profound, because it allows you to really understand the potential impact of your work. And our work has been developed into a field that in sometimes I think it's almost like banking. You count numbers, you count trucks, we count the amount of food rations delivered in a certain location to X number of people. We count the cash transfers provided into a social protection platform in a context where you can reach people who are besieged by war, or who can't leave a certain enclave because they're surrounded by armed groups. And that reporting of our work is by numbers. It's not by anything to do with people, relationships, impact, humanity. And you were right, Adrienne, when you were describing the project and yours and Kirsten's thoughts moving away from pictures. We report with pictures and numbers, and it's such a shame, because when I read the book and understanding the role that literature plays, especially for those thinking about coming into this field of work or within this field of work, it provides, exactly as Anuk said, that three-dimension, but for workers in that environment, it's almost should be the starting point. To ensure that you're driven by the right values, that you're in the work for the right reasons, and that the way that you work doesn't have a negative consequence on the people that you're trying to support. And that's particularly true for the Sri Lankan case, and I'm so privileged to also be of Sri Lankan Tamil descent. And I have seen myself in the work in Sri Lanka, especially after this tsunami, which is where I might have met Kirsten and we started working together actually in OCHA, but we were distributing assistance completely differently to different types of communities. Tamil communities would get a very different response to Sinhalese communities, and then the locations themselves also merited different types of response, and that had a huge impact on the cleavages that were already there within the conflict, but not something that we ever spoke about. And so the book really brought that to life for me and made me really question. But the role of fiction, I think you've hit the jackpot, and there's gold there, and we need to be using it far more deliberately and more, I think, carefully when it comes to working in this environment and enlightening those who want to work in the role of humanitarian assistance.
Well, thanks, Anuk and Rebecca, for those really amazing responses to Adrienne's question. And thank you to Adrienne and Kirsten for, bringing us together. It's very humbling as someone who's, teaches and researches on literature for a living, to be in the same room online with all of you, and with Anuk, such a distinguished novelist already, and how this extraordinary book, and Rebecca, just to have the benefit of the wealth of your experience working for over 2 decades in humanitarian response. So what does the novel suggest about the power of fiction to address such urgent matters, as war, trauma, conflict, humanitarian crises, which can, be totally overwhelming, even when you're at a distance. I think one thing that Anuk's novel does so wonderfully, and which really great fiction, and this is the real thing, can do, is just to validate the importance of storytelling. I mean, we've got storytellers of all kinds in the novel. It's, as Anuk was saying, the insistence on the importance of people's interior lives, but we see these, extraordinary situations where Krishan, the protagonist, is allowing us into his very interior, intense world, the love affair with Anjum, and then these incredibly tender scenes between Krishan's grandmother and Rani, who's come from the north, who's obviously devastated, struggling with what we, recognizably PTSD from the loss of her sons and the devastating end stage of the that genocidal end to the conflict in the Sri Lankan civil war in the northeast. So I think the novel, it also helps us, it does a kind of memory work. I mean, often in conflict zones, there's a damage to memory, on the one hand, of individual human beings who were there, and communities, of various scales. That's registered in the novel. And then there's this work of governments to create very actively, as Krishan reflects at one point late in the novel, the work of forgetting. I mean, people need to forget to heal and recover, but then the novel fiction can document official efforts to really silence and destroy historical memory. And that causes enormous ethical and political problems, both for the people in the war zones. But, what if we're at a distance and we want to respond in an ethical or informed way? The memory work has to be done. We have to inform ourselves. What happened, in 2008, 2009 in Sri Lanka, after an enormously long, decades-long civil war. And I think that the other thing I'd say is just, this is so finely written. There's such great attention to language and words, also to images and their effects on our consciousness, for better and for worse. And I think fiction can sensitize us to the way words are used. What does it mean to call a conflict, state-sponsored violence, a war? What does it mean to call a conflict a civil war, to suggest that the violence is coming from within, that different governments don't have responsibility for escalating violence and so forth? So I think there's a way in which fiction and Anuk's novel helps interrupt this kind of normalizing logic that, do we have to accept that we live in the US, the forever war era, as the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were referred to? Is war, what's going on in Israel, Palestine, in Gaza, the West Bank, is this just normal? Is this the way we have to live? And I think what's so beautifully humane about Anuk's novel is, this insistence that some people will have to live with this violence and its traumatic consequences forever. But actually, as human beings, we can interrupt these cycles of violence, that art and artists, like humanitarian response workers, have something to offer. Each of us have agency. We can get involved, and your novel, I think, really involves us, Anuk, so profoundly, but it asks something of us. So, okay, now what? It's really powerful. And thanks for your novel. It was an incredibly moving experience, and I'm planning on teaching it in the future.
Patrick, thank you for that. And this is actually kind of a perfect segue into a question that many of our readers raised for Anuk, and people said this in different ways, and I'm going to sort of condense it to say that you've described Passage North as more kind of about witnessing violence from afar rather than experiencing it up close, and that you're sort of grappling with this experience of war and sort of being powerless to act, which Patrick just sort of touched upon. But at the same time, the war is sort of reverberating through the everyday of the novel, right? It's sort of erupting without warning. And the way that you've written it is that it's continuous with the main character's interior thoughts, with Christian's reflections on everything, on his life and his environment. So can you tell us a little bit more about your choice of style for this subject, and also for your intended and imagined audience, the decision to write in English versus in Tamil? Oh, you're still muted.
Those are very good questions. I think this novel is very it's very internal. There's not much action. There's not much dialogue. I think well, I mean, it's useful maybe to compare this with my first novel, which kind of projected a consciousness into the midst of what now among Tamils is referred to as Mullivaika, the last phase of the war in 2008 and 2009. It was when shells were falling every day, where people were dying every day, where people were losing limbs and being amputated and so on and so forth. And that novel was very much about what we might call the spectacle of violence as a sudden, disruptive, shocking event, which we might compare obviously to other ways in which violence acts more invisibly and more sustained institutionally and in other ways. But having written that novel, I felt the need to also reflect on my own relation to the war, which was not which was a relationship of distance. And one of the big differences between the two novels is how much more sound there is in the first one, and how much more vision and how much more important images are in the second novel. Sound is something that is very immediate. You hear a sound and you turn around immediately. If you don't see what you are, if you hear something before you see it, you are taken by shock. You are taken by surprise. And in my first novel, there was characters often heard things before they saw them. This novel is kind of a muted novel. It's a novel with image but no sound. And the reason was was because this was a novel reflecting on what it means to witness your own community being destroyed at a distance. The distance not just geographical. Half of our community, 1.5 million people, live outside the island of Sri Lanka, but also distance of a temporal distance, because often there was a time lag between the events that were happening and the images of these events making their way to us outside the war zone. When we heard about the genocide, it was already over. There was a very distinct and difficult sense of having to reconcile these visions of a world collapsing with, for those of us outside the war zone, with environments in which everything went on as normal, in which there was no sense of the world being destroyed, which is also a kind of, it's a psychological contradiction that often leads people outside a war zone to want to create a sense that the world is being destroyed, to protest, to break, to loot, to set fire to things, just to kind of eliminate or reduce this kind of cognitive dissonance. Another very vivid part of this experience was helplessness, the inability to do anything. And I think for me, this is very much why these facts are why the novel is written in the way it is, because there is no action in the novel, because the narrator is a narrator deprived of agency. He is primarily watching, even in the only situation which is really kind of like among people at the funeral towards the end of the book. He is simply watching. He is not acting. He is continually interpreting, because again, all he gets is images, right? Images that are that underdetermine the actual let's say the psychological nature of the event. So, and then we have a character who is very much kind of in his thoughts. There's very little. We see the outside world impinging or interrupting on his stream of consciousness very minimally. And yeah, I don't know. To me, all of these things are all of these qualities of the text are qualities of a person who or somehow belong to a person who is forced to witness and who is unable to act. When you're unable to act, when you're unable to engage, one is forced into oneself. One is forced into one's mind. And I think also with events like this, violent events that create rage or create anger, create a sense of urgency about some kind of political action or some kind of indeed humanitarian response. I think it's good sometimes to be able to, or to be forced into a situation where you cannot act, where action is often a way of averting one's eyes. It's easier to bandage your child's wound than to sit there and look at it, right? If you're not able to actually deal with the injury or the wound, you're forced into a very difficult psychological situation. In a sense, part of the project of this work is also to force that situation onto myself as a writer, and then also onto whoever reads the book.
Thank you. I'd like to invite Rebecca and Patrick, if you'd like to respond to anything Anuk has said, and before we move to the next question.
I probably need to just say that I think the way that Anuk wrote it for himself, he said first, as myself as a writer, the same level of impact I felt when I read the book. And maybe that's to do with my cultural heritage rather than my role in my work environment. And I think it's beautiful because it calls into question a lot of my reasons for joining the UN, for working in the industry, stems from the imagery that is so beautifully described in Passage North. And the Passage North raises so many issues around the subject matter that I cover a lot, which is conflict sensitivity. And conflict sensitivity is a field of work within humanitarian and development action that you train on, you write modules on, you have tools that look at how to be conflict sensitive when you deliver assistance. And in so many ways, you can cut through all of that training I felt for something like Sri Lanka if you just read the book, because it brings out all of the dynamics that you need to know and you need to understand. And I found it quite hard to separate my work from my heritage. And I think I'm very much like you, Anuk, in that I was observing the war from a distance. But it impacts your family so profoundly. And of course, there was a lot of rallying, I think, amongst the community in London, in Paris, in Toronto. And you feel it quite strongly. I was very close to my grandmother, who talked a lot about it at home. While my parents were saying, don't talk about it, don't talk about it, don't let the children know. They wanted to build us up to move on for something that they were trying so hard to move on from themselves. But actually you come to realize that you can't, you have to address it head on. And so the parallel, Anuk, that you drew of the bandaging a wound, it's very much that. And I think being able to address it allows you to be a better person when it comes to addressing your values and what you stand for or not. So yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, Rebecca, that's so moving and well put. And Anuk, I thought the way you were just articulating, I mean, that really described my sensation. I think it's quite risky what you do in the book in terms of, you know, from the having I remember watching those scenes you know, of stunning violence on the TV, the way they were portrayed in the American media and you know, on the BBC from a Western perspective. And I think I also remember the report of these demonstrations in Canada that you described, where people just shut down the highway, I think in Toronto, and just trying to get my head around what was going on. And at that point, you know, I'd read Michael Ondaatje's novel Anil's Ghost. I wanted to ask you if to some degree you were responding to that, but one thing you do, I mean, a conventional plot would have had, as you said, Anuk, it would have had Krishan do something, or so he learns that Rani has died in mysterious circumstances, and you do drop a couple of seeds in where at a certain point I was wondering about the abrupt end of the love affair. Well, what has Amjun gone off and done? Is there some secret plot that is going to be revealed? But no, you don't go there. And then you say there's a plethora of these terrible accidental deaths of people who survived the incredible violence in 2008, 2009. And how could it be that people who are seemingly resilient, this very neoliberal bureaucratic word, are now just dying these accidental deaths like she does? And I guess a conventional plot would have been for him to go and solve a mystery, you know, and that a lot of contemporary war narratives often draw on crime fiction or detective fiction, or, you know, the thriller. But you kind of refuse that. And the other thing that you do, especially in the middle of the novel, is you have these, as you know, this fantastic description of the journey north, you know, with all that may or may not bring. Of the protagonist is on the train, he remembers this love affair and this 3-week idyll before it sort of seemingly went wrong. And at that point I was wondering, you know, why is there this romance? Because it's actually, for a novel that's dealing with such difficult you know, situations and the traumatic aftermaths of you know, of conflict, it's very romantic. And the descriptions of the love affairs, you know, you sort of swept away, but it's also, it slows things down. And I was sort of thinking, what's going on here, you know? So I'm wondering, were you consciously thinking, you know, just in terms of plot possibilities or, you know, genre conventions, and were you also deliberately refusing going in a more conventional directions in the story?
Thank you, Patrick and Rebecca, for those comments and those questions. I think, yeah, it's a good question. You know, I myself am not exactly sure. One writes and one reflects afterwards, but upon reflection, I think there was a very immediate desire. I had been, at that point, I had written a very, very difficult book, my first novel, and I was continuing to write on this material. And I think part of me simply wanted to write on something that was a little bit more lighthearted, or a little bit. There was a desire for me to dwell in what could be a moment of joy or something like that. I think philosophically speaking, this book, though, you know, it's also not just it's not just concerned with victimhood, in the sense that it does also describe scenes from the liberation struggle against the state. It describes the Tamil Tigers. It describes a couple of female cadres and their relationship to the separatist movement. It describes institutionalized days of mourning that the Tamil Tigers, the LTTE, ran for several years in these vast cemeteries. And Anjum is a figure in whom, how to put it, both love and political action. This book is very interested in the passing of time and the everydayness of time, the banality of time, and it is also therefore interested in the possibility that human life offers for escaping this mundanity, escaping this everydayness, and both love and political struggle are two, let's say, ways by which many people have believed they can escape time, that they can stop the world as it is. It's part of the vision of the two tiger cadres who seek death and who seek a certain kind of submission to something greater, or a kind to dissolve into something greater, their political cause. And it is also part of what Krishan desires, or what attracts him so much to this person and the experience they have together. It's not accidental that Anjum is also in various ways, specifically in terms of her kind of distance that he's always experiencing in her presence, that she's also a kind of in many ways similar to the two tiger cadres that come up in the novel. It's not an accident that he is attracted to her, and it's also not an accident that both these forms of life, or both of these, let's say, ideals of liberation, let's call them that, these ideals of for liberation from ordinary life involve certain forms of let's call it blindness, let's call it not seeing certain things, which is the case clearly with these two women in the movement, and which is also the case clearly with Krishan, who is only seeing or accessing Anjum from a certain kind of perspective. So this, yeah. So I mean, I would say they come together for me thematically in this way. They're both models of liberation.
Rebecca, I wanted to turn to you now and just talk a little bit about your experience as a humanitarian, working not only in conflict zones, but really in the very long aftermath. And I wanted to know what kind of policy issues and priorities the book raises for you that you want readers to understand better and know more about, and that the book can sort of help you open up for people who are interested in thinking about this period and this particular geopolitical context, but also more broadly about kind of when conflict ends, but then, as it were, when it sort of continues to echo, right? And that the kind of real challenges often are coming after, because that after lasts for so many years, or lasts for, it affects so many people.
Yeah, that's right. No, it's a great question, Adrienne. And the one thing the book raises for me is that issue of everyone seeing the war in Sri Lanka ending in 2008, 2009, and then Krishan's working years later, but still for an NGO, and work is ongoing even after there is this, what I would say, a very false line in the sand of when the war ended. There's no such thing for me as a Sri Lankan Tamil that the war has ended. And I used to find it quite difficult when colleagues would say, well, we can start up operations again in Sri Lanka because the war is over. And I go, oh, we can go on holiday in Sri Lanka because the war is over. And I found that very sad, I think, that you could just flick a switch and genocide and we're good to go. And that sort of getting into the real deep effects of the impact of war, and then what the role we have in humanitarian and development action in the recovery period is very, very important to understand. That it's not just a monetary cost on infrastructure, which the UN is exceptionally good at. We work closely with the World Bank, and we will do an assessment, and we will tell you that you need X billions to rebuild. But there's no sense of whether the rebuilding will bring communities back or not. It's very much from an economical perspective and not from a social perspective, and that's important. Transition out of conflict is years of study, and I hope students at the university will be thinking about this line of work as they move forward. But to do it well, you must understand the roots of the conflict. To do it in a way that has impact, you must understand the history, and we don't always have that. We don't have the luxury of that in the time frames of the jobs that we sign up to. It can be 1 month, it can be 6 months, or in my world, it's 4 years, and then we move. And what can you really do on the recovery side within 4 years for something that has an impact for a century? So that's incredibly important for me, and the novel also raises those issues, because as I read it, I didn't feel that it was so far behind 2008. I felt it was almost the year after. But you could write it for today, and I'm curious to know from Anuk whether it was written more recently at the time of your writing. Was it that present day, or were you writing it from a different perspective in time?
I wrote this, I think I wrote it between 2017
Mm-hmm.
and 2021, and I believe it's set around 2015. So it's actually, it's set 5 or 6 years. It's set 5 or 6 years after the war. I mean, hearing you talk, I mean, there was a question that I had for you, and this was something that Patrick had touched upon before we went live, which was, I mean, you've been working in this field now for 20 years, 24 years, and you've mentioned that it was this event, this historical event that pushed you into it. And it's something that I thought about as I was writing Krishan's character and talking about Krishan's desire as an academic or potential academic to return to Sri Lanka. And his, again, he has this kind of idea of total, of a total transformation, of some kind of utopian future that is possible out of the ruins. And it is this kind of this kind of this kind of vision of like a totally different life, a totally different world that is pushing him to it, and that it's the realization that such a world or such a reconfiguration is impossible that leads him to move back to Colombo. And I was wondering, does that, as a source of motivation, this kind of, I can give my all to this because I know what will be produced, or because I hope this kind of religious belief in the potential of intervention, was that something that you have experienced, and if so, how does one survive the disappearance of it?
I think you have to have that belief to be in this world, in this work. You can't not. And I think you find that because it's so complex, you start to believe over time, and this is something that, as I was mentioning before, it's changed since I joined when I was 23, and today I'm, I shouldn't give away my age on a webinar, but I'm 48, and I'm totally different as a person, as in terms of what I believe and what I think I can achieve. But I started off incredibly idealistic and incredibly hopeful for humanity, hopeful for everything that we were doing, and I found like-minded peers, and a kind of constant drive that if you just continue, it was going to get better. And it's interesting because over time I've moved into the World Food Programme, and food it's an interesting tool, whether that's to start dialogue and conversations, or whether to win or lose a war. You can do it with food. You can besiege a city and cut them off. It's the oldest tactic. And I've spent a lot of time studying that, and you realize that it's all cyclical. So you can make progress, but in the field of famine, for example, the places that have famine, you come back to it every 3 to 4 years. And that's when you start to see that it's not just conflict, it is also these interlinked drivers of climate change or of socioeconomic impact. And the more you understand, the more you see the situation, the more you realize how helpless you are to make change. So did I lose hope? I don't lose hope. I lose more the willingness to keep doing the same thing over and over again. I have known the passion's not there as it was at all. Where I do have a new passion, which I think comes from having a family and from looking and seeing different lessons in different contexts and in different countries. So Sri Lanka has definitely framed my foundation for the work, but I've seen success in Afghanistan. I have. It might not be so great now, but there are pockets of stability where communities come together and there's peace, and as long as you protect them and keep them out of the radar, you can see hope. I see a lot in Ecuador. Here it's beautiful, and it's not just, it's conflict in a different form. It's conflict in a kind of gang warfare as opposed to outright civil conflict between two races. It's very much tied also to drugs and economic power. So depending on the context, you can make change. But in a situation like Sri Lanka, if there is no conflict resolution that's rooted in democracy, and if it's going to be a resolution that's about the annihilation of a people, your response and your transition out of conflict is never truly going to be a transition out of conflict. That's what I feel from a personal perspective, and just my own views.
Thank you, Rebecca. I just want to interject. One of the attendees has people have been posting questions and responses, and one of the things they've just someone has posted saying that the Anjum and the Tigers that they seem to get some kind of liberation through social action, through war movements, but Krishan doesn't seem to get that liberation. He's sort of in the same, perhaps in the same zone that Rebecca is describing, where he doesn't sort of come off as being able to kind of get out of a particular stuckness that has to do with how he's encountering his reality. But I want to just pivot for a minute, seeing that we're sort of heading up to the end of our hour, and just ask Patrick to reflect a little bit as a literary scholar who you've studied thinking about violence and thinking about culture, war culture and post-war culture, and thinking a little bit about the novel and how it understands violence as this constant double perspective. I was really struck by so many moments where Krishan is describing where violence seems to suffuse the places that he's walking. So, for example, he says the mood and texture of the violence was suffusing the places to the extent that even his way of walking was changing when he was in the Northeast. His sort of bodily movements, his gait is acquiring the same quiet reverence of someone moving in a cemetery or a cremation ground. And I'm wondering how you see the novel's depiction of war as never officially ending, as continuing in so many complex ways, as a kind of with a wider perspective of how war literature is dealing with a kind of enduring or kind of never-ending sense of the presence of war, to kind of go back to Rebecca's sort of idea of the cyclical, to sort of bring us back around to some of our initial questions at the beginning.
Yeah, well, thanks. I mean, that's a great question. And I think, Rebecca actually responding to Anuk's question about, Rebecca, you were just saying, having been pushed into humanitarian aid work and working in conflict zones from, you know, the Tamil experience in Sri Lanka, and that's informed your work, and it's really inspiring, you know. I think one thing that the novel helps us do is imagine, you know, just how challenging doing this work for 24 years must be. And I loved what you said about there are pockets of hope, and it's important to remember that even in extremely dark times historically, there's historical contingency. There's nothing inevitable about a state of war. And the other thing, I mean, one thing I reflect on a lot in my work on war literature and war culture is that when you find a gap or a silence in a war culture, it's never a natural thing. It's a constructed silence. It's a normalized silence, and it's so important. I mean, Anuk, I thought it was amazing. You said that you shifted from sound in your first novel, the auditory, to the visual sense. In this novel, it's such a powerfully visual novel. But there's this amazing scene at the end where I guess it's after Krishan has been out all night celebrating the New Year, and he comes back in, and Rani and Apama, his grandmother, they were going to watch this movie on a film on TV. But the grandmother, of course, falls asleep after 5 minutes. And then Rani tells Krishan that she watched the whole film with the sound off, and he can't believe it. And he says, now, did you have the, you know, because he is a researcher, you know, he has the power and the agency to, even though he's witnessing at a great distance, which is wrenching, from right at the beginning of the novel, he does what I'm sure a lot of us do. It's like, I want to try and understand what's going on far away. You know, he goes to the internet, he watches videos, he researches, he has the power to research. And then the researcher that he is, he says he can't believe she watched a whole 2.5-hour film with the sound off. So he said, was the sound low or was the sound off? It was off. And then he reflects in this wonderfully reflective way, this character you've created, that actually what Rani was doing was creating a different mode of spectatorship. She sort of invented a new way to watch a film. You turn the sound off, and actually she's interacting with the world and with images, and in this really powerful way. And I think one thing your novel does so fantastically well is says to us as readers, look, you know, we've got this habitual relationship to spectacles of war at a distance, you know, in the global South, communities of color enduring incredible suffering. And there's this sort of structure there. But that's not good enough, you know. It's as you were saying, Rebecca, I guess there are these frameworks within humanitarian response industry that they position us, they make this seemingly intolerable situation stable, like this could go on forever, but it really can't. So it's like, so here's a book that says, wait a minute, what if you try and realign the way you interact with images of human suffering? And there are, I mean, there's the great question in the chat is, what about, so this is about a passage north, and there's this stunning ending. I mean, anyone who hasn't got to the ending of the novel yet, you know, you gotta read this novel. And you know, after the cremation of Rani right at the end. So it makes you wonder, okay, there's a passage north, but what about the return, you know? And I think in a way, Anuk, I don't know if this was a conscious design, but you are giving us tools. I mean, if Krishan it's unfair to ask of a writer, you know, okay, now what did he do after the end of the book? Have you imagined that or not? But whether or not, you know, there's a return, you know, a passage south, and there's a whole new chapter for this character that we've spent so much time with. I think you've given us tools in the novel to, you know, I don't know what it is. If we're turning the volume down, we have you, Rebecca, you mentioned how important it is to have more time, just to sort of slow things down and think differently. So, Anuk, does that make sense as a response to what we're left with at the end? I mean, what do you
Yeah, I haven't really thought about what happens after the end. It's one of the it's a privilege that I had as a writer to be done with it at that point. Yeah, I don't know if there are tools. I mean, the novel ends on a very ambivalent note, or at least the character is left in a state of ambivalence. And I was saying in relation to the question that was asked, that the narrator's view of, as I've said, Anjum, or these two female fighters, it's not a neutral one, and he's very much seemingly invested in viewing them as unambivalent people, as people of conviction, and his romance with this form of conviction clearly has to do with his inability to sustain a kind of conviction himself. My own view is that that there is and always will be ambivalence. It's just a question of acknowledging it, that all forms of extreme conviction are also ways of not paying attention to complicating factors. And my suspicion is that both the two women who died, the two Black Tigers, as well as Anjum, for themselves also probably feel this ambivalence.
Thank you, Anuk, and thank you, all three of you. We're at time. So I want to thank you so much for such an invigorating and beautifully expressed conversation about this book. Thank you to Anuk, thank you to Rebecca, thank you to Patrick Dear as well. And we will have this recording posted on the readforaction.org website in the coming days. So if you missed part of it, please come and see the rest of it. It's well worth your time. Thank you all for a wonderful discussion.